once you understand that we're wired into the mechanism and we impact how things happen, then you now understand certain things in history that don't make sense, okay? So what we can do at this point is look at the third hine in the dream of Yaakov laying down to sleep. And the first hine, look deeper, I'll show you that heaven and earth connect here, that's a ladder. Second hine, you'll see the angels are going up and down, which we thought was backwards, it turns out it's not. But now to historically make sense of, let's say, Jewish history, if we look at the third hine in the dream, God says, look deeper, after the ladder, after the angels, hine, look deeper. And what's the next vision God shows Yaakov, Jacob? Do you remember the third thing in the vision? Believe it or not, it's a vision of God. He gets a prophetic vision of God, whatever the world that means. Don't ask me what that means. But some sort of godly vision appears after the vision of the ladder, after the vision of the angels. God says, hine, look deeper and I'll show you me, so to speak, if such a thing were possible. So where does God appear? So it says God appears standing alav, and in Hebrew, alav means on him, meaning God appears standing on Yaakov. Now, what in the world does standing on Yaakov mean? So what's that metaphor teach me? So if I take my son and stand him on my shoulders, and I walk around the streets of Jerusalem, so what's my message to everybody? My message to everybody is, never mind me, take a look at my son, huh? Pretty special guy. Because I got him on my shoulders, which means I understand my job is to bring him out into the world so everyone can appreciate him. So when God appears standing on Yaakov as the third hine in a row, look deeper, God says to Yaakov, and you'll see, you're bringing me out into the world. Meaning, Yaakov has worked on his Torah and mitzvahs so intensely his entire lifetime that it's gotten to the stage where when people look at Jacob, at Yaakov, people don't think about Yaakov, people think about God. Yaakov's walking around and says, never mind me, let's talk about God. So God says, listen, you're bringing me out into the world through everything you do. That's called God standing on Yaakov. Now, that's the deeper idea of what it means when Isaiah says that we're supposed to be a light unto the nations. I mean, a lot of people don't understand, what does it mean we're supposed to be a light unto the nations? So if I asked you, what's the Jewish mission to be a light unto the nations? You'd say, well, we have the Ten Commandments. Maybe we're supposed to get out there and teach all the Gentiles about the Ten Commandments. And the answer is no. That light to the nations doesn't mean we're supposed to teach them Torah. Light to the nations means when you and I do what we're supposed to do, the other nations are supposed to look at us and think about God. Even if you don't say anything to anybody. I'm pausing for dramatic impact. Okay. Meaning, when a guy walks into, when somebody Jewish walks into 7-Eleven, so you walk into a 7-Eleven to buy a bag of potato chips. The guy behind the counter is not Jewish. He says to his buddy, hey Frank, you see the guy who walked into the store with that funny thing on his head? He's one of those Jews. You know those Jews, they're so kind, they're so honest, they're so caring, they're so sensitive. There must be something to that God of theirs. That's called being a light to the nations, even though you didn't say anything to anybody. He looked at you, he thought about God. That's our job. What's the opposite possibility, God forbid? The opposite possibility is you walk into the store to buy a bag of potato chips, the guy behind the counter is not Jewish, he says to his buddy, hey Frank, see the guy who walked in the store with the funny thing on his head? He's one of those Jews. You know those Jews? They're just like everybody else. If he says they're just like everybody else, then you just took God and threw God out of the store because he looked at you and all he saw was you. And now you're not a light to anybody. Now that's called not doing your job. In either case, you never said anything to anybody. Right? A light to the nations means when we're doing what we're supposed to do, then people are supposed to look at us and think about God. That's called I've got God standing on my shoulders. Never mind me, let's talk about God. That's what Jacob's earned, and that's why God's standing on him, so to speak, because people are thinking about God when, in everything Yaakov does. Okay? Now, this creates a beautiful, easy to spot difference between Judaism and idolatry. Because in idolatrous religions, God with the small g, as in many gods, is here to serve me. So I'm gonna I'm going to say, what can I get out of this God? In Judaism, I'm here to serve God, so God's standing on me. In idolatry, it's the exact opposite. What can God do for me? So if you want to see a case study in idolatry, look at the end of the book of Genesis, the first book of the Torah, and the beginning of the book of Exodus, the second book of the Torah. And you'll see the Torah spends chapter after chapter looking at ancient Egypt, because that was an idolatrous nation that believed in lots of gods. So since Joseph was sold into slavery by his older brothers and spent, years down there, he started out as a slave, and then he became a prisoner, and eventually he became Secretary of State of Agriculture for Egypt. But the Torah invests a lot of effort and energy into talking about ancient Egypt, and we can learn a lot about idolatry because it was a pagan country. I'll give you an example. One of the gods of ancient Egypt was the Nile River. They worshiped the Nile River because they were dependent on it for water and for irrigation of their crops and food, fishing it and everything. So they worshiped it like a god. Now, Pharaoh has a dream. And in his dream, this god of his has 7 fat cows come out, followed by 7 thin cows. And then the thin cows eat the fat cows. And Pharaoh wakes up and knows that's a problem, because number one, his god is producing something weird. And number two, his cows are not carnivorous. They don't eat other cows. So he calls his advisors, he calls his astrologers, he calls his magicians, and he says, listen, I had a weird dream. I know it's significant. Somebody's got to help me out and tell me what's going on. Nobody can explain it. So the wine steward comes over to him and says, listen, the wine steward was in jail a few years ago. There was a Jewish guy there named Joseph, and the wine steward and the baker had dreams. Nobody could figure out. They told it to Joseph. Joseph said, this is what's going to happen. And everything he said came true. So why don't you bring this Jewish guy out of jail and tell him your dreams? So Pharaoh says, okay, bring him out. So they bring Joseph out of jail. And then the Torah does something very unusual. It almost never does. And that is, it repeats the dream when Pharaoh tells it over to Joseph. Now, the Torah rarely ever repeats information unless there's a good reason to do it. So what should the Torah have done? The Torah should have shown you the dream when Pharaoh was sleeping, which it does. The next morning, Joseph comes out of jail, and then the Torah should have said, and Pharaoh told Joseph the dream, and Joseph said, this is his interpretation. Instead, the Torah has Pharaoh, when he tells over the dream, we include Pharaoh's version in the text of the Torah. Last night I had a dream, 7 fat cows come in on the Nile, follow this out. So the commentators are going, why is Hashem putting the dream in there twice? Why can't they just reference the dream? And if I can't remember it, I'll back up a few verses and reread it myself. So the answer to that question is, the reason the Torah repeats the dream is because Pharaoh starts lying and he starts changing details when he tells it over to Joseph. And the only way for you and I to catch the lies is for God to show you the version he sent when Pharaoh was sleeping, and then show you the version that Pharaoh tells over to Joseph the next morning. And if you put them side by side and compare them word by word, you'll see the changes Pharaoh makes. For example, one of the changes he makes is when he was actually having the dream and the cows were coming out of the Nile, where was Pharaoh standing? So it says Pharaoh was standing al hayar. He was standing on the Nile River, which is very weird. In other words, in his dream, he's standing on the Nile and the cows are coming out of the Nile. He won't say that the next morning. It's too strange. So he says to Joseph, last night I had a dream, and in my dream I was standing al sfat hayar. I was standing on the banks of the Nile, which makes a lot more sense, but is not true. He wasn't. He was standing on the Nile. Why? Because in idolatry, you stand on top of your God. He was standing on the Nile because his attitude was, what can this God do for me? If this God can't produce what I, Pharaoh, need, I'll get rid of him because I got another 30 gods to choose from. So in idolatry, you stand on top of your God because God's here to serve you, God with a small g. In Judaism, God stands on top of you because you're here to bring God out into the world. That's the difference between Judaism and other pagan religions. You gotta track who's here to serve whom, right? Always ask the question, when you're looking at other religions comparing to Judaism, who's here to serve whom? There's an interesting comparison, therefore, in Christianity. Let's take Judaism. In Judaism, Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son for God. But in Christianity, God was willing to sacrifice his son for you. So that's God's here to serve me. That's called I'm standing on top of God. That's a throwback to a pagan concept. You follow? Mm-hmm. So that's one of the differences you always try to look for when you're comparing religions.